What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I am your host, Baby Arugula, and thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Making Music with Baby Arugula. For episode 7, I am taking you inside the mix of the track that we've spent the last 6.5 weeks working on. It's already mixed, so this is going to be like a retrospective sort of look at what I did, not like a live tutorial. I'm going to take you through my sort of thought processes, almost sort of philosophy. Mixing kind of is like a philosophical kind of thing. There's a lot of debates about doing certain things. Like, so for example, really common debates in mixing are, should you boost or should you cut, right? And a common argument / metaphor analogy that I hear is like, think of it like sculpting. If you're Michelangelo and you're sculpting, you know, you're cutting, and that's how you make your art. You're not just like plastering shit up there that wasn't there to begin with, which I think is true for that particular medium of art with those tools. But I think by the same logic, you could also argue that you don't paint the Mona Lisa by taking apart the canvas or by taking paint off the canvas. You have to add, right? So I think and in this art form, we have the tools to do both, to sculpt and to add. So I feel like really there's a time and a place for both, and you have to develop your skills as a mixer to know when to do either. And I've only been doing this for 8 years, so compared to those who have like 10, 15, 20, 50 years of experience, you know, my ears and my decision making isn't quite as refined, but I'm getting there. So I feel more along the lines of, you really have to feel it, and there's a time and place for both. If you hear that 300 hertz is really raunchy and it's getting in the way of the low end and the crispness of the fingers or something, then instead of boosting the low and the mids, cut 300, you know? And I would typically look to cut before I boost, but if I don't hear anything that's worth cutting, then I'll boost, is kind of the way that I think of it typically. Another common debate is like, should you make subtle movements and kind of let the natural voice and fullness of the instruments come out, or should you make more drastic moves of like 7, 8, sometimes 15 dB of EQ in certain areas? I think there's a time and place for both. So we'll see that kind of come into play here in the mix. But without any further ado, I'll stop rambling. Let's go ahead into Logic and I'll show you exactly what I did. As you can recall from the previous episode when we organized all the tracks, we've got all of our color-coded instrument groups here. And so basically the first thing that I'll do when starting a mix is what's frequently referred to as a static mix, where you don't touch any plugins, you're just bringing up the faders and getting your panning and your levels correct. And most likely you're going to automate your volume and your panning anyway, but I save the automation for the end and just kind of get a general idea of where I want things to be, and that gives me the feeling and the vibe of the song overall. And then I use that information to think about what needs to be enhanced, what needs to be brought out, and kind of enhance and also problem solve at the same time. So looking here in our mix menu, or mix window, you can see I got a lot of buses, and we're going to talk about the buses, but first I want to just look here at the audio effects. You can see, for the most part, when we get to the buses, there's some plugin chains going on, but for the most part, we're really using 1, maybe 2 plugins on occasion. And that one plugin is the Sheps Omni channel. Now, I have a few channel strips, and I've been going back and forth between a few of them, but I decided to go with the Sheps Omni channel here for the flexibility, because I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do. But this is pretty much all that I'm doing, is just a little bit of saturation on occasion. Like 50% is probably like the highest that I go. Most of them have probably less. A high pass, varying frequency depending on what the instrument is. Here it's the snare. Typically I won't go above 80 on a snare drum. And then a little bit of thump, and then adding some mids, just a little bit. And this is where, so we talked about cutting versus boosting, and little bumps versus drastic change, or like, subtle movements versus drastic movements. In this beginning stage, I will start with subtler movements and typically with cutting before boosting. Those were 2 boosts there, but generally speaking, that's where I'll start. So here on the kick drum, right, we got our saturation again, high pass, thump, couple boosts there. So, I'm not afraid to boost, but they're all subtle boosts, right? And so we can kind of just go along the line, and not all of them have any EQ. For a lot of them, the EQ's turned completely off. It's just saturation. Some of them, it's only high passing. But the Shep's omnichannel just kind of creates that console-like kind of workflow where you have everything right there in front of you. You don't have to use all of it, right? But the Shep's omnichannel just kind of provides some extra flexibility in tone shaping, so that's nice. So that's kind of where I'll start, is I'll pick a channel strip that I want to use for this project, and then I'll put it on pretty much everything. And I'll start with subtler moves, and I'll feel around and see if anything needs to be cut. In this scenario, my drums were samples, and so they're pretty much perfect. There's not really a whole lot that needs to be cut. So really I'm just picking the parts of the sounds that I want to bring out, and then boosting those subtly. And then also using things like the vitamin on the kick drum to kind of bring out some lower mid harmonics. That's what's going on there. On the bass, you'll remember from last episode, we duplicated the bass and created 2 tracks. That's because for one of them, we put a low pass filter on, rolling off everything above 200. So pretty large roll off there. And so that's just getting the low end. I'll play for you what that sounds like. Right, and then this other one, as you may have guessed already, has a high pass filter rolled all the way up to 200. Oh, almost 200, but give or take 200. Maybe it should be exact. I don't know, actually. If you know, if you have a reason why those should be exact and not roughly where they are, I'd love to know if there's a scientific explanation. But I guess that was at 198. Didn't seem to bother me too much. But anyway, so this bass 2 is just getting the fingers. Right? And then we blend them together. And there's our bass sound, right? So this allows you to individually control and sculpt the low end, and also compress and control the fingers without destroying your low end. Now we've got our guitars again. I've got the Renaissance axe adding some overtones or some harmonics to specific guitar parts that I wanted either to emphasize or that just needed help sitting in the mix. And for the most part, just the Shep's omnichannel with a high pass and maybe a little bit of saturation, but not much. Our keys, same thing, as you can see. Our horns are kind of a special case. The individual horn tracks all have the omnichannel on them, but we'll talk about the horns in a second. And then all of our things that Henry sent us and the recorder, again, just Shep's omnichannel. So in terms of the processing going on the individual tracks, pretty simple. The complicated work that's going on here is happening in our buses. So let's take a look at our drum bus. We'll start with this one. Pretty simple drum bus chain going on here. Slow attack, quickest release, ratio at 4, and averaging around 2.5 dB of gain reduction. And this is dual mono, by the way. I like dual mono on things that are stereo buses that have different information on the left and right side. Because if you compress them the same, then maybe there's nothing really going on the left side, but the right side's driving it crazy, and so you're compressing when you don't need to on your left side. So dual mono just kind of helps maintain the width and not compress things unnecessarily. With our drums, right, if we come back here, we got a lot of buses going on. So our snare drum in particular gets sent to a lot of buses. The snare drum's one of them. I don't like to say that any instrument is more important than the other, but if you look at where the snare is being sent to, you can see that it's contributing a lot to the sound of the mix, more so than pretty much any other instrument. So our snare drum is being sent to a room, and this room, it's not just oh, this is a snare room. especially in scenarios where I'm using a lot of digital and sampled instruments. I like to put everyone in the same reverb room as though they were playing together. And I'll use more reverbs than that. It's not the only reverb that I'll use, but just as like a starting place, it'll be a shorter reverb, kind of quieter in the mix, but just something to add a little bit of atmosphere that kind of holds everything together. And then a parallel distortion bus with the kick drum and the snare drum. And then the break crush, this is like another parallel distortion thing for the kick drum and the snare drum, but it's for the kick 2 for our rhythmic kind of breakdown right before this really nice spacious part. And then our break room is another room for that same section of the song. And then a parallel drum bus that's just adding a little more impact to our drums. So those are kind of the buses that are going on, and each of our drums are being sent to them based on what they need. And then our percussion are all being sent to bus, which one is it? 28? Oh, I see. Our output here, right, is bus 12, right? So this is our percussion bus, right? And then our percussion bus is being fed back into our drum bus. And our percussion bus is being sidechained to the kick and the snare parallel distortion bus. And so because the percussion occupies a lot of that 2K and above frequency range that our snare, the crack of our snare kind of lives in, if our percussion isn't perfectly on time, you get this like instead of a ka ka type thing. And so you don't want to be confusing the crack of the snare. That is an instance where the snare kind of is the most important instrument. You really need the snare drum to be on time. And if something's fighting with it, it doesn't sit well. It's kind of compressing extremely, around like 5 dB. I guess I decided not to, but sometimes I'll roll back the output just to make it a little more subtle. But that's just kind of ducking out the percussion each time that the snare drum and the kick drum hit. But it is, you can see here we've got the filter on, and it's high passing at around 3K, so it's only getting the smack of the kick drum and the snare drum. That way the kick drum isn't like compressing it by like -20, and then the snare drum's doing like -2 or something like that. So that's what's going on. All those are being fed back into our drum bus, where we have our stereo bus compressor, as I mentioned, or dual mono bus compressor. And then we've got the J37 tape machine. Settings are pretty standard for me, 7.5 IPS, 888. The level is just normal with just a smidge of saturation. And that's pretty much it for the drums. The bass bus is being fed from both the bass channels, and here, you know, our bass processing on the individual channels is pretty simple, right? But here, we've got our C6 just kind of giving the subs a little lift, but also tucking in some around 150. There was just a little bit of buildup around 150. It's kind of a vulnerable frequency range, that like 150, maybe like 120 to like 180. 180 can sound really nice on bass, but there can also be some buildup. And so the C6, what it does is it'll compress it, but only when there's too much. So that's nice. A little bit of EQ, just kind of helping. Just like I've selected frequencies that I know sound good on this kick drum from playing around, and then frequencies that sound good on the bass, and just kind of helping sculpt them so they're not fighting, but they're sitting within their respective places. And so generally what this curve looks like is, what is that, around 700? Basically the kick is kind of like in this sub range down here between 30 and like 60, and then the bass is kind of occupying this range right above. And then we're boosting the fuck out of 700 hertz, and then another tape machine on very similar settings. So that's that. And then we've got our guitars, pretty simple. This is our rhythm guitar bus, so we have guitars that are panned left and right doing different things. So once again, we have our dual mono bus compressor, right? And then another tape machine with pretty similar settings. No saturation this time, I don't believe, nope. And then our rhythm keys, nothing. Our keys really, you know, they're sampled instruments, so they sound good. We do have a little bit of high passing going on the instrument channel themselves, but that's pretty much it. Our lead guitar is being sent to a plate and our space reverb. We'll get to the various sends in a little bit, and then just an LA2A to help control it. Our lead keys, they're only being sent to the lead plate. So the lead plate is for both the lead guitar and the lead keys. It's just generally speaking for the melody. And then our horns, we're definitely got to spend some time talking about our horns, but once again we got our dual mono bus compressor. Just a little bit of EQ going on, give it some air, cut out some of the lows, and then tape machine once again. And then our recorder, the recorder is just being sent to basically all of the reverbs and delays, most of the delays, all the reverbs. Because the recorder, I don't play recorder. I'm all over the place with my pitch, I'm just kind of making noise, so it really, the recorder is kind of more for the vibe than for like being a proper part. SFX, these are all the effects that Henry sent us. Once again, we got our dual mono bus compressor, right? A little bit of EQ and tape machine. And then we have our rhythm guitar and our lead guitar all being sent to this guitar bus, where we just got a dual mono LA2A and another tape machine. And then we have our lead keys and our rhythm keys being sent to here, where we just have a little bit of a mid cut and then another tape machine. So that's kind of like, that's all the processing going directly onto the channels that we created in the last episode when we were organizing it. So now let's talk about the effects that we did after. And typically I'll do most of these things first, because these are more subtle moves. They give me an idea of the direction I'm heading in. And then we get here, right? And so you can kind of tell how I developed this mix and where my head was based off the order of these buses, right? So after kind of getting our drums and our bass sitting, and just kind of, I knew that I wanted, like, I put the tape machine and the SSL compressor on because I want to control everything a little bit, but also kind of glue it together and bring out some of the sustain of certain instruments and whatnot. Tape machine, I really like the sound of tape, and I try to put the tape machine on as many things as possible, so I do. So I'll do like various stages of bus processing first, right? And now it's like, okay, so what needs to change? Well, the horns are really quite possibly the most significant part of this song tonally, or at least not tonally, but like harmonically. It's the most significant group of instruments playing like notes. And also because it's a sampled instrument, it's fake essentially. They're not real horns. They sound particularly fake because you know what a real horn sounds like. So some work needs to be done to get these to sound a little more lively, a little less robotic. So the first thing that I did was sent them to a room, and this is just like a short room, because if they were real horns, they wouldn't be playing directly into your computer. They would be mic'd in a room, right? So we have them in a room. You can see the fader is real low. It's pretty quiet, not doing a whole lot. And we've got the H delay here on a 94 millisecond pre-delay. This is basically acting as our pre-delay. And then that's going into the Abbey Road chambers. We got a pretty short time, yada yada yada, right? Rolling off around 220 and then rolling off around 9K. And this is probably the least rolled off reverb that we have because it's a smaller room. So the more high frequency you roll off, the farther away in space it gets, right? And so this is the reverb that we want to have the closest. So this is, all of our other reverbs are actually rolled off even steeper. And I have another channel EQ here. Interesting. I wonder when I decided to put that on, because I don't usually do that if I have the option to control it within the reverb itself, but that's interesting. And then a sidechain compressor going on here from the horn bus itself, just kind of helping it. Quick attack, relatively kind of a slower release. I'm surprised that I did that, but I think I must have been watching the meter and dialing it in accordingly. Yeah, so that sidechain compressor just helps the horns stick out in your face, and then the room kind of fills in afterwards. And that's real quiet again, but the horn room, right, so all of our horn tracks separately, individually, are being sent to the horn room, so that way their panning carries through, so it really does feel like they're in a room. And then that room reverb goes back into the horn bus, where it goes through the compressor and kind of glues together in with the dry horns. and then this horn is sent to the room where all of the instruments are here, right? Many instruments, most of the instruments are being sent into this room, which has an H delay as another pre-delay, and then the Abbey Road chambers again, but a different room this time, slightly different EQ settings, and then another sidechain compressor. And so that's what's going on the horns, in addition to, lastly, this horn distortion here. But I want to carry on going like kind of from left to right in the order of my buses. The first thing was, right, as I mentioned, horns aren't recorded directly into your computer. You have to mic them, right? So I was like, okay, how am I going to recreate that? Horn room, right? Okay, we got our horn room processed. Sounds better, right? And then the next thing, I do this on pretty much every mix that I do if it has guitars, and I'm a guitar player, so almost everything that I do ever has guitars in it. And that is 2 delays panned left and right, assuming that there's 2 guitar parts. And so what I'll do is I'll take the guitars that are panned to the right side and send them to a delay on the left, and then take the guitars on the left side and send them to the right, right? And so here I'm using the soft tube delay. It's a pretty nice sounding delay. Our lead guitar needs some delay as well because it's the lead, and the lead kind of comes in at a spot where the song's more intense, but it's not necessarily more aggressive. It's not like a lead part where, you know, before you're playing like a chunky rhythm and then you step on your tube screamer to play the lead. It's more of a spacious lead. So we have our lead delay here, the H delay again, and then Valhalla space modulator. And then I was like, okay, cool. So we got our horn room, we got our guitars with their delays on them. Now, because it's also kind of weird sometimes, like sometimes you don't want a digital reverb because they just don't sound great all the time, but also sometimes just having a delay that ends abruptly is also kind of weird. So I set up the room here. The room, as I mentioned, has the pre-delay on, and a lot of stuff is being sent to this room because we want it to feel like there's a band playing together in the room. So I'll let you hear what's going on in this room track here. So that's that. And then our space here, right? This time we're using a soft tube reverb. It has the longest pre-delay of 94 milliseconds. It's the large hall, very long reverb time, and the color is set to dark because it's supposed to be super spacious and deep and out there, and so you want to roll it off. And just to be sure of it, I added another EQ rolling off. It's probably the lowest low pass, I guess, that I have on any of these. And then to kind of space it out even more, we've got the Valhalla space modulator on there yet again. So now we got all of our spaces set up, right? We got our horn room, we got our delays, we got our lead delay, we got our room, we got our space. So now it's like, okay, I've added all of this room to everything, and I've processed the buses, but now my drums aren't punching the way that they were before and the way that I need them to now, right? So I took the kick drum and the snare drum and sent them to a parallel distortion bus of kick and snare. And this is a scenario where I had a little bit of trouble because I used to just immediately reach for the Soundtoys Decapitator, but I don't have that anymore. So I kind of had trouble searching through all my saturation and distortion plugins to find one that I felt suited the occasion, and I landed on the one knob driver and it got the job done. And then now I had my kick and my snare punching the way that I needed them to. And then I was like, well, the horns, you know, they have the room, but they still sound kind of fake. They need like some glue, but I don't want to just compress the shit out of them because they're even as it is anyway, because they're sampled horns. They're not actually played. So instead of parallel compression, I reached for parallel distortion, did a similar thing, and normally this is a scenario where I would also go for the Soundtoys Decapitator, but landed on the Black Rooster Audio V-Pre 73 and just cranked the gain, high pass, dialed back the trim a little bit, and then a high shelf, and that sounded pretty good. So so then we got our drums pumping, we got our horns with a little bit of parallel distortion, and then it was like, you know what, I'm kind of losing the fingers of my bass, so we needed some parallel distortion on the bass. And this is not being sent from the bass bus, but actually from the bass fingers track, right? Because we don't want to be distorting our subs and our lows. We want to distort and control the fingers. So I tried a few saturation things. You can see I got the soft tube saturator, but I landed on the Audio Assault Head Crusher instead, which I bought for like $5, I think, because it looks like a Sound Toys Decapitator, and I thought, if I need a Sound Toys Decapitator replacement, then this is probably it. It does not sound like the Decapitator, but whatever, it's fine. So anyway, we got our bass distortion, we got our fingers kind of slapping through a little bit more, and then I was like, okay, we got all our guitar delays, we got our rooms, we got our spaces, what else can we do? And then I was thinking, maybe the keys could use a little bit of delay. So we got an H delay on the keyboard here, and then the choruses needed to be even a little more spacious, and after the rhythmic break section we needed a little bit more space, so I added a plate reverb, and basically all of the leads are being sent here. And once we did that, we were sounding pretty much done for most of the song. But then there was this bit here, right here, which, before having done the break crush and the break room, sounded like this. Boring. We do this, we put them back in. Much better. So on the break crush is basically just another parallel distortion on the kick and the snare drum, but this time we're sending it through the King's microphone and then through the head crusher again. And then we have another room that we're using, which is probably why my CPU is like damn near about to overload, because we have so many Abbey Road chambers. But another one of these, it's in a mirror, so it's super reflective again, and we're just crushing the shit out of it with Kramer Pi and a side, is it side chained? No, it's not. Another compressor. And then an EQ just kind of taking out some 700 there. So at that point, everything was sounding pretty good, but between our like 2 or 3 shakers, our jingle, our hi-hats, there was a lot of high frequency information in the drums that was competing with the snare. And so I needed to find a way to help the snare come through, but I liked the sound of the snare and I didn't want to just like distort it more, because we already have 2 parallel distortion buses on there. So we took our percussion and we routed all of our percussion to its own bus, and then sidechained it to the kick and the snare drum, so it would just duck out of the way on those kick and snare hits. And then this EQ here, you know, like I said, sometimes you need to add like 8 fucking 10 15 dB of something, but for this, just 2 dB of some air, you know, high shelf at 12.5K. Just kind of added some air to the shaker, wasn't in the way of anything else, and with that sidechain compressor, just kind of helped it stay out of the way, but also add space. And then we had a parallel drum bus here. We're just using a Fairchild emulation, just kind of getting a little more oomph and a little more smack out of our drums. And that's it, you know. You can tell from the order of my ascends here, the kind of way in which I diagnosed the problems and what needed to be enhanced in this mix. And the last stage of this mix kind of took a while, to be honest, because it's a really important part of any mix, and depending on what's going on in your particular song, it can take quite a while, but it's really important, and it makes a mix really come to life if you do it right. And I can't claim that like I'm fantastic at this, but you kind of just have to follow your ears and your instinct. But what I'm talking about here is in particular pan automation, which you can see I have here. The panning is green, so they're not all selected, but you can see here there's like a green line. That's all panning automation. There's pan automation all throughout this mix, all over the place, and it it brings it to life. It really does. Even on some of these buses, and then volume automation as well. Certain areas like the rhythmic breakdown here, I'll play for you. See how the break room and the break crush drop back down. We don't want those effects on the drums the whole time, you know. We have volume automation on the space reverb for this part with the recorder, right? And then as we get to the end of the song and the climax, we have a couple things ride, in particular for the second half, and then sometimes even a little bit of automation on the stereo out bus. Now, I'll probably do more of that in like the mastering stage, which I feel like that's stereo bus automation. I feel like is typically more of a part of mixing than mastering, but I'm going to be mastering it myself, so I would rather have the entire finished product kind of swing like that. But yeah, I just didn't want to let the automation go unnoticed and untalked about, because it's really a crucial part of this mix, and really a crucial part of any mix. If you're not automating your panning and your volume and various sends, then I really implore you to do so, because it'll make your mixes more interesting and just give you ideas that maybe you had but you didn't know how to do, or you didn't have and now you will have after playing with automation. It's a really important component to mixing. So anyway, just wanted to address that. Yeah, so pretty simple mix with regard to plugins. I mentioned this in the last episode, and now you can really see it. The buses really are where the majority of the work takes place, at least for the way that I like to mix. There's a lot of instances of the Abbey Road chambers, which is probably overloading my CPU. We'll talk about this in the next episode when we talk about mastering, which will be fucking sick, but my CPU was kind of overloading, so I couldn't actually bounce out the whole thing as a stereo file. So next week when we get into mastering, we're actually going to do what I've heard referred to as stem mastering, where you bounce out all the instrument group stems and then you master there. And so that kind of gives you like a secondary buffer where you can be like, you know, the drums and the bass are kind of building up in that 150 or that 300 range, and you can kind of do a last. That's a scenario where you really do want to make subtle movements, like 1 dB, maybe 1.5, like tops, because you're affecting so many things, and you don't want to end up losing all the body in your snare drum by trying to take out some boxiness in your kick drum or something, you know. Anyway, yeah, I mean, you can see I got a lot of Waves plugins, but also you can see this comes with Logic. You know, I use the stock Logic compressor pretty frequently, and I've got the stock Logic EQ all over the place, you know. So mixing, I've been doing this for 8 years now. Like I said, some people are doing this for 20, 30, 40, 50 their whole lives, you know what I'm saying? So I can't claim to like have this like massive wealth of knowledge that no one else has, or claim that like I'm not still learning, or that I know everything that I will. But if you're looking at this and you're like, man, like I can't do what you just did, that's not true. You totally can. Just use what you have, because this is exactly how I was mixing before I had all these plugins as well. So because that's kind of another contentious area within the mixing world. There's like, do I boost or cut? Do I do small movements or big movements? Do I need the most expensive plugins, or can I use what's stock? You can absolutely use stock. You can absolutely boost or cut, and you can absolutely make small changes or big changes. It really depends on the play style of who you recorded, or on the samples, or on the genre of music. And really, you know, digital recording and digital mixing has not leveled the playing field in the sense of like now anyone can do it, but leveled the playing field in that now you can really just make sounds that sound good to you, and you don't really have to worry too much about the technicality of things. There are certain things that you want to keep an eye out that are good practices, but really you can just follow your ears and do what you think sounds good. So that's going to wrap up episode 7 of Making Music with Baby Arugula. Me, I hope that this was insightful and entertaining. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions or ideas, or you want, I don't know, whatever the fuck it is, whatever is on your mind, don't be a stranger. Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell below. Also, go follow me on Instagram. I update regularly on the status of creating these videos, on the status of my music, and then also just fun things with my kitties and just daily stuff with me. So definitely go follow me on Instagram. It is babyarugula_prod for production. But yeah, so go follow me there, and then subscribe down below, comment, like, more Ashlyn in future videos, more kitties, all that good stuff. And next week for episode 8. So episode 8 is going to be really special because that is the last episode of this season of this series. It's been a really awesome 7 weeks putting this together. I'm more than ready to be done. I've been having this song playing on repeat in my head for almost 2 months now, which is just ridiculous. Like, normally if I wasn't filming this whole process week by week, I would just grind on it and finish the whole thing in like a few days. So it's been a roller coaster, but I'm glad that it's coming to a close. So this is coming out on Friday the 9th. On the next Friday, on the 16th, our video taking a look at the master will upload, and the song will also go live on Spotify, Apple Music, BandCamp, pretty much any streaming service you use. I'm not sure if I'm going to do SoundCloud, but however you get your music, you will probably be able to find this song that we've been working on together there. So thank you so much for joining me for the last almost 2 months, and I hope you will stick around for the final episode of the series, and then subscribe, because now that we're done with this series, we're going to do a bunch of other cool things. Well, I'm not going to give it all away, but we got a lot of cool stuff planned. And so we're going to take a break from this style of video, and then we will come back with season 2. I don't know. If you want to know when we come back from season 2, you got to subscribe and follow me on Instagram. That's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.